Welcome. Today we look back at one of the most defining events in human history, World War II. This was a conflict that reshaped nations, transformed societies, and changed the role of the United States in the world forever. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains alone, but a record of decisions, sacrifices, and consequences that continue to shape our present. This is the story of World War II. Night over Normandy. In World War II, few American soldiers lived a war as intense as the paratroopers. They didn't advance behind artillery and tanks. They were thrown ahead of everything, into darkness, confusion, and enemy territory, expected to hold the line until the rest of the army arrived. Their uniform, their gear, and even the way they moved through the world were built for a single moment: the jump. By 1944, the United States had trained thousands of airborne troops for one purpose: opening the door into Nazi-occupied Europe. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were not ordinary infantry. They trained harder, marched farther, and carried heavier loads. Their identity was stitched into their jackets, unit patches, jump wings, helmet markings, and taped straps. They wore M1 helmets with netting, sometimes painted insignia, and carried M1 Garands, Thompsons, BARs, grenades, and knives. Their jump boots were distinct, built for impact. Their parachutes were carefully packed like life itself depended on every fold, because it did. On the evening of June 5, 1944, airfields in southern England became staging grounds for something Europe had never seen. Paratroopers lined up beside C-47 Skytrains, their faces darkened, their equipment checked again and again. Each man carried not only a weapon, but a mission. Some carried demolition charges to blow bridges. Others carried radios heavier than rifles. Some carried extra ammunition for the men who would land far from supplies. They were loaded with so much gear that many could barely stand without leaning. Inside the aircraft it was loud, cramped, and unnaturally calm. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, helmets pressed close, hands resting on weapons. Some prayed. Some joked quietly. Many said nothing at all. They knew the statistics. They knew the drop would be scattered. They knew anti-aircraft fire would be waiting. They also knew there was no turning back once the green light came on. As the C-47s crossed the channel, the world below disappeared into darkness and cloud. Navigation depended on timing, instruments, and thin lines of light from Pathfinder teams who would mark the drop zones. But weather and smoke changed everything. Planes drifted, formations broke, and then the coast of France appeared, followed immediately by tracer fire. German flak tore through the night sky. The C-47s were slow and vulnerable, flying straight and level to keep drop accuracy. Some aircraft burst into flames. Others limped forward with engines failing, still holding course because turning meant scattering men into unknown territory. Inside, paratroopers stood, hooked their static lines, and waited for the command to jump. The red light held. Seconds felt like minutes. The aircraft shook from near hits. Then the green light flashed. Go. Men stepped into darkness one by one, vanishing instantly into wind and chaos. The shock of the jump hit like a punch. The sound of the plane vanished. The world became wind, straps, and the violent pull of the chute opening. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the ground rushed up. Many landed in flooded fields deliberately prepared by German defenders. Some drowned under the weight of their gear. Others landed in trees and were shot while struggling to free themselves. Some landed miles from their units and moved alone, guided only by distant gunfire and the instinct to find fellow Americans. Yet the airborne plan did not collapse. It adapted in real time because paratroopers were trained for chaos. Small groups formed around whoever they found. A lieutenant with 5 men became a platoon. A sergeant with a radio became a command post. They attacked crossroads, bridges, and enemy strongpoints not because they had perfect maps, but because action mattered more than clarity. By dawn, Normandy's countryside was filled with scattered American paratroopers fighting in pockets. They cut telephone lines, ambushed convoys, seized key roads, and forced German units to respond in the wrong direction. Even when drop zones failed, the effect was still strategic. Confusion, delay, and disruption during the hours when the beach landings depended on time. This was the airborne war in its purest form: improvisation under fire, discipline inside chaos, and the refusal to stop moving. The men who landed that night were not behind enemy lines as a phrase. They were inside it, and they would hold, bleed, and fight until the rest of the invasion caught up. Because on D-Day, the first Americans in France were not those who stepped onto the beaches. They were the ones who fell out of the sky, scattered but fighting, holding the line. After the drop, when dawn broke over Normandy, there was no neat front line for the American paratroopers. There were no battalions advancing in formation, no clear command posts, no secure supply routes. There were only small groups of men, often strangers to one another, armed with whatever they had landed with, trying to impose order on chaos before the enemy could recover. The scattering was extreme. Some paratroopers landed exactly where planned. Many landed miles away. Radios were lost or damaged. Officers were killed or separated. Entire companies ceased to exist as organized units within minutes of landing. Yet airborne doctrine had anticipated this. Paratroopers were trained to operate independently, to rally around any leader, and to attack objectives based on opportunity rather than orders. Men moved using sound and instinct. They listened for American voices, for familiar slang, for the click of U.S. weapons. A single shout of, "Hey, Joe," could draw men together in the darkness. Hand signals replaced radio commands. Helmet markings, white spades, hearts and diamonds, helped identify units in low light. When doubt remained, accents settled it. Small groups formed rapidly. A corporal with a few men might decide to assault a machine gun nest because it blocked a road. A lieutenant with a handful of paratroopers might seize a bridge simply because it was there and undefended. These actions were not planned on maps. They were driven by training that emphasized initiative over hierarchy. German forces reacted slowly and unevenly. The airborne drop achieved its primary goal: confusion. Reports flooded German headquarters, describing landings everywhere at once. Units were ordered to counterattack in the wrong directions. Columns were ambushed by men they could not see. Roads were blocked by destroyed vehicles and felled trees. Telephone lines were cut, isolating commands. American paratroopers exploited this confusion relentlessly. They used hit-and-run tactics, attacking supply convoys, small garrisons, and artillery positions. They avoided prolonged firefights when outnumbered, choosing instead to strike and vanish. Ammunition was precious. Grenades were used carefully. Fire discipline mattered because resupply did not exist. Defensive positions were improvised quickly. Paratroopers dug shallow foxholes with entrenching tools, bayonets, or bare hands. Hedgerows provided cover but also concealed danger. German patrols moved through the same fields, often unaware of how close they were to American positions. Sudden, violent encounters erupted at close range, leaving little time for fear. One of the most critical tasks was securing causeways and bridges behind Utah Beach. German forces had flooded large areas to slow an invasion. Narrow raised roads became choke points. Paratroopers fought to hold these routes against counterattacks, knowing that failure would isolate troops landing on the beaches. Holding a single causeway could mean the difference between success and disaster. Leadership emerged naturally. Men followed those who acted decisively. Rank mattered less than clarity. Orders were short and direct. Cover that road, hold this field, watch that hedgerow. Paratroopers learned quickly who could be trusted under fire. Those who froze were bypassed. Those who moved forward were followed. As daylight grew stronger, the airborne troops faced a new danger: visibility. German forces could now see how thinly spread the Americans were. Counterattacks increased. Mortars and artillery found their range. Paratroopers were forced to hold ground with limited ammunition, often firing captured enemy weapons when their own ran low. Despite this, morale held. Paratroopers understood their role. They were not expected to win battles outright. They were expected to delay, disrupt, and confuse until the main invasion force arrived. Every hour they held mattered. Every German unit diverted toward them was a unit not attacking the beaches. Contact with advancing ground forces began slowly. By late morning and afternoon, American troops pushing inland from Utah Beach started linking up with airborne units. For many paratroopers, this moment was almost unreal. Men who had fought alone or in small groups for hours suddenly saw columns of friendly troops arriving through the hedgerows. The airborne mission had succeeded, not because it went according to plan, but because the men involved adapted instantly. They did not wait for perfect conditions. They fought with what they had, where they landed, against an enemy just as confused as they were. By the end of the first day, the beaches were secure, and the invasion was irreversible. Paratroopers began to consolidate, reorganize, and prepare for the next phase of fighting. Many would not get relief for days. Some would never leave Normandy alive. But the door into Europe had been opened, not by precision, not by perfection, but by men who refused to stop fighting when everything went wrong. Linking up, holding ground, and the cost of success. By the second day in Normandy, the airborne war entered a new phase. The chaos of the drop began to settle, but the danger did not diminish. Paratroopers who had survived the night now faced a harder task, holding ground against an enemy that was regrouping, reinforcing, and beginning to understand what had happened. Link up with forces from the beaches was slow and uneven. Terrain worked against everyone. The Normandy hedgerows, dense earthen banks topped with thick vegetation, turned fields into natural fortresses. Visibility was limited. Movement was slow. German defenders used these hedgerows to stage ambushes, placing machine guns and snipers to cover narrow approaches. For airborne troops low on ammunition and heavy weapons, every engagement was a risk. Paratroopers dug in wherever they stood. Foxholes deepened. Firing positions were improved. Captured German weapons were put to use immediately. Machine guns, rifles, and ammunition taken from fallen defenders. Improvisation became routine. Radios that still worked were guarded carefully, becoming lifelines to artillery and higher command. When radios failed, runners carried messages under fire. German counterattacks intensified. Units from nearby garrisons moved to contain the airborne threat. Mortar fire fell on suspected American positions. Small probing attacks tested weak points. Paratroopers learned to conserve strength, firing only when targets were clear, letting the enemy come close before opening up. Surprise mattered more than volume of fire. Leadership pressure increased sharply. Officers and non-commissioned officers were killed at a high rate. When leaders fell, others stepped forward without hesitation. A private might suddenly find himself directing fire or coordinating movement because no one else was left. These moments defined airborne culture. Initiative was not encouraged. It was required. Medical conditions were grim. Wounded men lay in fields, barns, and hedgerows, often without evacuation for hours or days. Medics worked with limited supplies, improvising bandages and using captured equipment. Painkillers ran out quickly. Men learned to endure silently, knowing that noise could draw enemy patrols. Some wounded never made it out. Sleep became rare. Paratroopers rested in short bursts, weapons always within reach. Night brought renewed danger. German patrols moved cautiously through fields and villages, attempting to locate and eliminate isolated American groups. Flares lit the sky suddenly, turning darkness into harsh white light. Firefights erupted without warning, often at close range. Despite the pressure, airborne units continued to accomplish critical objectives. Key roads remained blocked. Bridges stayed in American hands. German units were delayed and misdirected, buying precious time for the invasion force to push inland. Every hour of disruption reduced the risk of a coordinated German counterattack against the beaches. As more American infantry advanced from the coast, paratroopers began transitioning from isolated fighters to part of a broader front. This shift brought relief, but also new challenges. Airborne units were under strength, exhausted, and scattered. Reorganization took time. Replacements arrived who had not jumped into Normandy. Veterans tried to integrate them quickly, passing on hard-earned lessons without ceremony. The cost of success became clear in casualty lists. Entire sticks of paratroopers were gone. Some companies were reduced to a fraction of their original strength. The men who remained carried the weight of those losses silently. There was no time for mourning. The war was moving forward, and airborne troops were expected to keep pace. By mid-June, Normandy was secured enough to allow sustained operations inland. The airborne mission, open the door, hold key terrain, disrupt the enemy, had been fulfilled. But for the men who had jumped, the war was far from over. They would fight as regular infantry now, through villages, fields, and towns that offered no special protection for airborne status. The jump had made them famous. What followed would test them even more, because airborne troops were never meant to rest behind the lines. They were meant to move forward again and again until the war ended. Bastogne, surrounded in the snow. In December 1944, American paratroopers found themselves fighting a battle they had never trained for and could not escape. The forests of the Ardennes were cold, dark, and unforgiving. Snow covered the ground. Roads were narrow. Visibility was poor. When German forces launched their last major offensive in the West, airborne units were rushed into the line with almost no preparation. Among them were elements of the 101st Airborne Division, ordered to hold the town of Bastogne at all costs. Bastogne mattered because of its roads. 7 major routes converged there, making it a critical junction for any movement through the Ardennes. German commanders understood this. If Bastogne fell, the offensive could continue west. If it held, the German advance would choke on its own momentum. The paratroopers who arrived in Bastogne understood this quickly. They were told, simply, to hold. They arrived by truck, not by parachute. Many had left their winter gear behind, expecting a brief rest after Market Garden. Now they found themselves digging foxholes in frozen ground with inadequate clothing, limited ammunition, and almost no heavy weapons. Snow-soaked uniforms, boots froze. Frostbite became as dangerous as enemy fire. German forces moved fast, encircling the town within days. Artillery fire increased, mortars fell constantly. German infantry probed American lines, testing for weakness. Tanks appeared on the roads, forcing paratroopers to rely on bazookas, mines, and whatever artillery support could be coordinated. Communication was difficult. Weather grounded aircraft. Resupply was impossible. The encirclement was complete. Inside the perimeter, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food was rationed. Ammunition was conserved. Medical supplies ran low. Wounded men were treated in cellars and makeshift aid stations, often without adequate heat or painkillers. Medics worked continuously, improvising with what little they had. Evacuation was impossible. Everyone understood that if the line broke, there would be no retreat. German forces demanded surrender. The reply, brief, defiant, and famous, captured the mindset inside Bastogne. There would be no surrender. Paratroopers were not fighting for glory or headlines. They were fighting because holding Bastogne was the only option left. Combat around the perimeter was constant. German infantry attacked through forests and fields, often under cover of darkness or fog. Paratroopers repelled assaults with rifle fire, machine guns, and artillery fired at dangerously close ranges. Positions changed hands. Small groups fought isolated actions, sometimes cut off for hours. Leadership at the lowest level determined survival. Morale held not because conditions were good, but because cohesion was strong. Paratroopers trusted each other. They had trained together, jumped together, and bled together. That trust mattered more than warmth or comfort. Every man understood that the unit's survival depended on each position holding, no matter how exposed or exhausted. When the weather finally cleared, the sky became a lifeline. Transport aircraft dropped supplies by parachute, ammunition, food, medical kits. Some fell into enemy lines. Others landed exactly where needed. For the first time in days, paratroopers could resupply and reorganize. The effect on morale was immediate. Soon after, ground forces broke through to Bastogne, relieving the encircled defenders. The German offensive stalled and then collapsed. Bastogne had held. The road network remained in Allied hands. The momentum of the German attack was broken permanently. For the paratroopers who survived, Bastogne became more than a battle. It became a defining experience. They had fought surrounded, outnumbered, cold, and cut off, and endured. Many later said this was the moment they understood what airborne identity truly meant. Not the jump, not the uniform, but the refusal to give ground when everything was against you. Bastogne marked the end of the airborne war as a series of jumps. From here on, paratroopers would fight as hardened infantry, carrying the weight of everything they had already survived. And the war was moving toward its end. From Bastogne to the end of the war, After Bastogne, American paratroopers were no longer a force defined by parachutes. They had become veteran infantry, hardened by cold, loss, and prolonged combat. The war moved east, and with it moved the airborne divisions, now advancing on foot through forests, towns, and rivers toward Germany itself. The tempo was relentless, but the nature of fighting had changed. The enemy was weakening, yet still dangerous. The task now was endurance. Paratroopers pushed through the Ardennes as the German offensive collapsed. Roads were littered with abandoned vehicles. Prisoners streamed west. Yet resistance flared unpredictably. Isolated German units fought stubbornly from villages and wooded ridges. Snipers delayed advances. Artillery still found its mark. Paratroopers learned to advance methodically, securing ground before moving again, knowing that overconfidence could be fatal. Winter did not release its grip quickly. Snow and mud alternated, turning movement into exhaustion. Units advanced with limited rest, often sleeping in barns, cellars, or foxholes. Frostbite and trench foot continued to remove men from the line. Replacement troops arrived who had never jumped, never endured siege, and never known the tight bonds of airborne training. Veterans absorbed them quietly, teaching survival without ceremony. As spring approached, the Rhine loomed as the final natural barrier. Crossing it would mark the collapse of organized German resistance in the West. Paratroopers participated in river crossings, not as airborne shock troops, but as disciplined infantry, securing bridgeheads under fire. Engineers worked through the night. Artillery laid down smoke and suppression. When crossings were made, resistance crumbled faster than expected. Inside Germany, the war felt different. Towns surrendered or resisted unevenly. Civilians watched silently as American units passed. Evidence of the regime's crimes emerged: camps, forced labor sites, and ruined communities. For many paratroopers, these discoveries reframed everything they had endured. The cost suddenly had context. Combat still claimed lives. Isolated firefights erupted in forests and city streets. Fanatical defenders fought on. Accidents happened. Mines took legs and lives even as victory approached. The cruel randomness of war persisted to the end. Paratroopers learned not to assume safety until orders confirmed it. By April 1945, organized resistance collapsed rapidly. Units advanced with speed, taking prisoners by the thousands. Airborne divisions that had once been scattered across fields now moved as cohesive formations through enemy territory. The contrast was stark. What began in chaos ended in control. The news of Germany's surrender spread unevenly. Some paratroopers heard it over radios. Others learned from officers who gathered them quietly. There were no grand celebrations at the front. Relief came first, deep and physical. Men sat down where they stood. Some laughed, some cried. Many simply stared. For airborne troops, the war in Europe ended without another jump. The training that had defined them was no longer needed. Yet the identity remained. They had been thrown into the war's most uncertain moments and asked to hold when nothing else could. Demobilization began, but slowly. Paratroopers performed occupation duties, guarded prisoners, and helped restore order. The adrenaline faded, replaced by reflection. Friendships forged in combat faced separation. Men prepared to return home carrying experiences that would be difficult to explain. The airborne war had ended, not with a dramatic landing, but with a long march through enemy territory and a quiet acknowledgement that survival itself was victory. One chapter remains. What this journey meant, and what American paratroopers carried forward into the world that followed. Coming home. Survival, silence, and memory. For American paratroopers, coming home was not a victory lap. It was a transition filled with silence, confusion, and emotional weight that no briefing had prepared them for. The war had defined every day of their lives for years. When it ended, the sudden absence of danger felt unreal, almost threatening in its own way. Paratroopers, who had survived Normandy, Holland, and Bastogne, returned as different men. They had lived in constant readiness, sleeping lightly, reacting instantly, trusting only those beside them. That mindset did not switch off when uniforms were packed away. Back home, ordinary sounds triggered reflexes. Crowds felt uncomfortable. Quiet moments were often the hardest. Demobilization was gradual. Men waited in camps, performing occupation duties or administrative tasks while paperwork moved slowly. Friendships forged in combat were broken apart by shipping schedules and discharge orders. A man who had trusted another with his life might say goodbye with a brief handshake and never see him again. There were no words that fit. Families expected celebration. Parents, wives, and children wanted stories. Many paratroopers could not provide them. How do you explain the feeling of jumping into darkness under fire, or holding a frozen foxhole while surrounded? Most chose silence. Others spoke only in fragments, leaving out the parts that mattered most. Some paratroopers adjusted quickly. They took advantage of educational programs, found work, started families, and built stable lives. Discipline and resilience learned in combat translated into leadership in civilian life. Others struggled. Nightmares, restlessness, and sudden anger followed them for years. At the time, there was little understanding or support for what would later be called combat trauma. Reunions became important years later. Former paratroopers recognized each other instantly, by posture, by voice, by shared memory. Names of fallen comrades were spoken softly. Stories emerged slowly, often interrupted by long pauses. Time had passed, but the bond remained intact. The airborne identity never fully disappeared. Jump wings, unit patches, and helmet markings were kept as personal artifacts. They represented not pride alone, but survival. For many, those symbols carried the weight of men who never came home. As years turned into decades, the number of surviving paratroopers diminished. Their experiences moved from living memory into history. Yet the impact remained. The tactics they pioneered, the discipline they embodied, and the standard they set became part of military culture long after the war ended. Coming home did not mean leaving the war behind. It meant learning how to live with it. And for American paratroopers, that journey lasted a lifetime. Only one chapter remains. What their story meant and why it still matters. Legacy of the American paratrooper. The American paratrooper of World War II left behind more than a record of daring operations and famous battles. He left a legacy defined by adaptability, discipline, and the willingness to act decisively when plans collapsed. Airborne warfare was built on uncertainty, and paratroopers learned to function inside that uncertainty better than anyone else on the battlefield. Their first legacy was initiative under chaos. From Normandy onward, airborne operations rarely unfolded as designed. Aircraft drifted, drop zones were missed, units landed scattered and under strength. Yet paratroopers did not wait for perfect conditions. They rallied whoever they could find and attacked objectives based on opportunity. This ability to act without orders became a model for modern decentralized command. The second legacy was small unit leadership. Airborne combat proved that wars are often decided by corporals and sergeants, not generals. When officers were killed or isolated, leadership passed instantly downward. Decisions were made at the lowest level, often under fire, with incomplete information. This culture reshaped how American forces trained and fought long after the war ended. The third legacy was endurance without support. Paratroopers were often cut off, undersupplied, and surrounded. They learned to conserve ammunition, improvise defenses, and hold ground against superior numbers. Bastogne became the symbol of this endurance, but it was not unique. Across Europe, airborne units held critical positions until relief arrived, or until they were destroyed. The fourth legacy was psychological resilience. Jumping into darkness, fighting isolated, and enduring prolonged stress forced paratroopers to confront fear constantly. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. This understanding influenced how later generations approached combat stress and leadership under pressure. Airborne forces also changed how wars were planned. Normandy proved that vertical envelopment could disrupt entire enemy systems in hours. Market Garden showed the limits of ambition without flexibility. Bastogne demonstrated the strategic value of holding key terrain even when surrounded. Together, these lessons shaped post-war doctrine for airborne and special operations forces worldwide. On a human level, the paratroopers' legacy was quieter. Many carried their experiences silently for decades. They built lives, families, and communities shaped by discipline, learned under fire. They understood loss intimately and valued loyalty deeply. The bonds formed in airborne units outlasted the war itself. As time passed, the paratroopers' story moved from living memory into history. Jump wings and unit patches became museum artifacts. Names once spoken daily became inscriptions on memorials. Yet the influence remained. Modern airborne and special forces still trace their culture directly to these men. The American paratrooper did not win the war alone. But at the war's most uncertain moments, he was trusted with its highest risks. He was sent first, often alone, expected to hold until others arrived. That trust defined his role and his legacy. World War II demanded speed, sacrifice, and adaptability. The paratroopers embodied all three. They fell from the sky into chaos and imposed order through action. They fought without guarantees and endured without retreat. Their story is not one of flawless execution. It is a story of resilience. And because of that resilience, history turned in their favor. World War II reshaped the world we live in today. Its victories, losses, and lessons remind us of the cost of global conflict and the value of cooperation. By remembering this history, we honor those who lived through it and better understand the world they left behind. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.